Welcome, everybody. Welcome, everybody, to Sharia, a threat to American freedom. My name is Father Ezra Sullivan, and I don't know much about Mohammed. I do not take the Quran with me to bed every night. I do not have at my fingertips all the pertinent facts about Islam. And it's precisely because of this that I've been asked to introduce tonight's topic. I'm proud to say that I know the least out of all the people here on stage, and so that means that I'll be learning the most. So as we listen to these three talks on this single topic, I would like to note that there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end, and I invite you to consider three different ways to interpret these talks. The first way is to consider a warning about militant Islam as a sort of Chicken Little message. Chicken Little, you recall, was one who outside an acorn fell on his head, and he started running around telling people that the sky was falling. He went to Henny Penny. The sky is falling, Henny Penny. Well, the hen was convinced. And so then he goes to Loosey Goosey. Loosey Goosey, the sky's falling. She gets convinced. They go to Lucky Ducky. He's convinced, and so on. And of course, the thing is that the sky wasn't falling. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just there. And so when people sometimes hear about dangers of militant Islam, they'll say, you're getting worried about a whole bunch of nothing. Some sociologists suggest that Westerners have too much Islamophobia. They'll say that there's a myth of a Muslim tide. And they'll say that Muslim immigrants are just as harmless as Catholic immigrants and Jewish immigrants were once upon a time. Such views, however, overlook certain important facts, many of which we will hear tonight. Facts including statements in the Quran that promote violence to infidels. Facts such as in the Quran, we hear statements that say, do not take the Jews and Christians for friends. They're friends of one another, but if you take them for a friend, surely God does not guide unjust people. There are statements in the Quran about how to treat women, that a man can have up to 4 wives and as many concubines as his hands can conquer. That husbands have an obligation to hit their wives if they get high-minded. And there are also statements in the Quran which speak about violence. Warfare is ordained for you, it says, although it may be hateful for you. O those you who believe, fight those of the disbelievers who are near you. Do not obey disbelievers, it says, but strive against them. Because of such dangers and statements in the Quran, which Muslims traditionally interpret as the verbatim word of Allah, and which Muslims traditionally implement as Allah's will on earth, it's tempting to take another way to consider these presentations. Instead of seeing them as a Chicken Little message, some people will interpret them with despair. There's a temptation to see this as a message like that of Cassandra. In Greek mythology, Cassandra, you probably recall, was the one who was gifted with the ability to prophesy future events accurately. But Apollo, her rejected lover, well, he also gave her a curse. Whatever she prophesied would be disbelieved. And so, when Cassandra predicted to the Trojan people that this wooden horse was something dangerous for them, everybody mocked her and laughed. And of course, we know what happened with the Trojan horse. And so sometimes when people hear about warnings of militant Islam, they say, it's too late. Already they are inside the gates, and there's nothing we can do. In a certain sense, this is accurate. I personally have been affected by how warnings by Muslims themselves have been ignored by the government and by their fellows. So we all probably are familiar with the fact that in 2009, Major Nidal Hassan killed 13 of his own members of the army, and he injured more than 30 at Fort Hood. What not many people realize is that Hassan was an Army psychiatrist, and 2 years previous to this event, we say, he actually gave a PowerPoint presentation to his colleagues and superiors, and it was entitled "The Quranic Worldview as it Relates to Muslims in the U.S. Military." Among other things, he said this: "Fighting to establish an Islamic state to please God, even by force, is condoned by Islam." Another ominous claim he said, and I quote, "We love death more than you love life." Now, the thing is, why this hits me personally is because my sister-in-law was present at that PowerPoint presentation. She looked at him in his eyes. My sister-in-law is an Army psychiatrist. She lived actually not too far from his house in Silver Spring, Maryland. But thanks be to God, she wasn't there at Fort Hood. So some people will suggest then that it's a Cassandra message to suggest that there are dangers of militant Islam. People are ignoring them all the time. But I would like to suggest a third way to understand the message we're about to hear, and we can see this as the most reasonable and as the most patriotic. It's because I believe that this kind of warning is one very similar to one that had gone out in 1775. On April 14th of that year, General Thomas Gage received instructions to disarm American rebels in Massachusetts, to imprison the rebellion's leaders, particularly Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Facing an uprising American population, the general issued private instructions to his lieutenants saying that they are to proceed with utmost secrecy. Well, fortunately, there was another man who had intelligence on what was about to happen, and as soon as he found out that his compatriots were in danger, he went on a ride. It was the night ride of Paul Revere. And because of his courage, he went through the countryside warning colonists all along his route. And as he went from house to house, he eventually made his way to where Samuel Adams and John Hancock were. He got them out of danger, and he helped the Americans to push back the British forces all the way to Boston. And so many would argue that this is precisely what we're going to hear tonight, a wake-up call, telling us about dangers, telling us about opportunities that we have to help our country, to help our life, and even our faith. So tonight, then, we have an opportunity. Are we going to hear about Chicken Little stories, Cassandra prophecies, or Paul Revere warnings? It's up for you as a listener to discern and to decide. And so to help your prudence, I'm going to introduce to you our speakers. First, I would like to introduce to you, on my far left, David Yerushalmi. He is a nationally known Orthodox Jewish speaker and lawyer, an expert in risk analysis and geopolitical strategy and national security. David will talk on his work throughout the U.S. in forming public policy and about the theory that underlies the dangers of Islam. His talk is entitled Sharia, the Threat to American Freedom. Our second speaker, sitting next to him there in the middle, Robert Muse, a Catholic lawyer and expert in constitutional law. He is engaged in a number of cases to defend religious liberty, the freedom of speech, and the right to life across the country. He's been featured on Fox News events, as well as other major media in the news. His talk is Sharia, the Threat to the Constitution. And our third speaker, Al Kresta. I'll introduce him when it's his time to go.
Good evening. Thank you for having us here, and thank you, Father Ezra, for inviting us. The title of this presentation, Sharia, Threat to American Freedom, American Freedom Law Center, suggests that we have essentially three subjects to cover tonight. The first is, what is Sharia? The second, how is it a threat to American freedom? And third, something of special interest to me, American Freedom Law Center. I'm going to begin with the latter and then work back into the first two. 6 years ago, I began thinking about litigation in the context of the broader battle of Islamic terrorism, its effect on the banking industry through Sharia-compliant finance, and I reached out to a Michigan-based public interest law firm that was dealing mostly with Catholic and Christian issues, and I was introduced to my partner here, Robert Muse, and we began litigating in this area, and 2 years ago we formed our own organization, a national public interest law firm and public policy think tank called the American Freedom Law Center. I'm going to mention briefly why we came together as a bio, or a resume as it were, but I want to say this by way of introduction. Nothing that I say here today, and nothing that Robert Muse says here today, should be taken at face value. If there is a belief proffered from this podium, I would suggest to ignore it. If there is a fact that can be verified, I would pay attention. But what we propose to provide for you this evening is a factual examination of the question put before us tonight: Sharia, the threat to American freedom. My background goes back 30 years as a trial lawyer. I've been involved in national security, public interest related issues most of that time. I serve as general counsel to many public policy think tanks that deal with national security issues in Washington, D.C. And I spend an inordinate amount of time in front of judges arguing about issues that you and I would think were a given. Robert Muse served 13 years in the Marine Corps as a combat officer, served in Desert Shield and Desert Storm, later became a judge advocate, an attorney working within the military, and then spent a decade practicing law in the area of First Amendment litigation, religious liberty in the main. Together, we formed American Freedom Law Center 2 years ago, and we like to use the nomenclature as the first serious and original Judeo-Christian public interest law firm. We're going to come now to the main subject of the conversation this evening. What is Sharia and why is it a threat? The first question, what is Sharia? I noticed on the sign outside it talked about militant Islam. One thing that we're not going to answer here tonight is, what is true Islam? Is the Islam that we're told about by many individuals, both Muslim and non-Muslim, noble and peaceful religion, akin to the other monotheistic faiths of the West? Or is Islam what is articulated by the terrorist and the jihadist and the Muslim Brotherhood types across the country, across the world? That question will not be answered because I don't believe it can be answered. What we can do is provide you with what Sharia is and why it is the subject of tonight's discussion. Prior to 9/11, many of us in the national security field, especially those of us who dealt with terrorism, understood terrorism to be principally a question of politics. The largest threat of political terrorism were from the Palestinians. And most of us in the field consider this to be an issue of nationalism or real estate. One people lived in what was called Israel, another people wanted to occupy that territory for themselves, and that caused war. We've seen those kinds of political conflicts throughout the 20th century articulated through the context of terrorism. You had the Red Army, you have environmentalist groups, you have the terrorists in South America and elsewhere who are simply trying to use threats of terror and terror to achieve political ends. After 9/11, those of us in this field understood that the narrative no longer worked. All of the time that we looked at terrorism in the name of any group that tied itself to the Palestinians or Arabs or Muslims, we always moved it into the narrative of a political contest. After 9/11, if you looked at what the terrorists said, that was no longer possible. This battle was not about a piece of land, per se. It was not about nationalism, per se, or a sovereign desire to control land for a people. Rather, if you examine what the terrorists were saying, not only those involved in the 9/11 attacks, but you took a step back, as we did, and you looked at what they were writing and speaking about for years, whether they were from Yemen, from Pakistan, from China, from Russia, from Saudi Arabia. It didn't matter where you looked. What you found was as follows. Groups of individuals who all claimed to be engaged in terrorism for one end, to establish a political hegemony across the world called the caliphate. That political entity, the caliphate, was to be ordered and run according to Sharia. What is Sharia? Sharia is Islamic law. Each of these groups articulated those two goals and added to it the method by which we achieve that goal are three. Dawah, or persuasion. If that wasn't successful, Dhimmitism, which is a notion of subjugation. And if we couldn't subjugate the population, jihad or war. Those ends and methods were articulated by groups of jihadists, mujahid, across the globe, many of whom didn't read or understand Arabic. They didn't understand or articulate the plight of Palestinians. They didn't have the same political victimization narratives in their countries. That is to say, they were disparate groups with no common denominator, no dots to connect except one: Islamic law. So the next question we asked to determine what Sharia was and whether it was a threat to America was, is it possible that this grouping, these jihadists that have propped up and shown themselves around the world and have brought their attack to America on 9/11, is it possible that they're extremists, radicals, outliers, that they don't actually belong as part of Islam in any serious fashion? So what did we do? We examined their writings to find out exactly what was the source of this law. How did they articulate the law in the context of Islamic jurisprudence? And what did we find? We found that they all traced their legal pronouncements of a caliphate ordered by Sharia, achieved through dawah, dhimmitism, or through jihad in the same places. From the Quran, from the Sunnah, or the oral traditions that have been memorialized in writings, and from the legal pronouncements from the various legal schools. We then asked the question, well, is it possible that even though these disparate groups from different cultures and different political environments don't speak the same language, is it possible that they somehow arrived at the same legal conclusion using the same legal method by accident? So we then decided to go back in time and see if there was a historical pedigree to Sharia and these pronouncements of jihad. And what did we find? Again, the same thing. As we trace this back in time to the founding of Islam by their prophet Muhammad, we saw that these three methods and these two goals were consistent all the way through. At that point in time, most individuals who were engaged in this kind of study understood one thing. Sharia operates as what we call in the national security context as the enemy threat doctrine. If you're in a war or in a battle, whether it's on a battlefield or in a courthouse somewhere, you have to know your enemy, as we all understand, but you also have to know what drives your enemy. What is the ideology? What prevails upon him or her to put life at risk to achieve the goal? And what we determined was, according to their own language, their own pronouncements, it was Sharia. Everyone here, I believe, has received a book called Sharia, the Threat to America. This is a text that I was privileged to co-author with other senior and serious national security experts. And this text walks you through the analysis that we've just covered at a highlight. But what it also does, in a very serious and methodical way, is to walk you through how it is that Sharia operates as a threat to this country. Now, I've just given you one possibility, of course. The exogenous or the external threat to America. Muslims outside of America that operate in various jihadist groups have told us we follow Sharia, it requires a global caliphate, and we're going to achieve that caliphate either by persuasion, you're going to give up your constitution and turn the keys over to us, or we're going to engage in jihad. The text walks you through that aspect, but an additional aspect. One of the areas that we covered as part of American Freedom Law Center, besides litigation and courtroom battles, is public policy research. In 2008, after having examined Sharia as a threat externally, we decided to determine, does that threat exist here in the United States? As a preliminary study, what we did was to take 100 mosques randomly selected across the United States so that those mosques would be representative samples of Islam as practiced within institutions. We then sent in researchers covertly, and they would measure as an independent variable the religiosity, the Sharia compliance of the worshipers and the imam, and there were objective scales. As a dependent variable, they measured the presence of violent jihadist literature and the lectures by the imam and other speakers. Parenthetically, do you remember the Yemeni American al-Waki who was killed by a drone who had been involved in 9/11? During this study, we had actually identified the mosque where he had been invited to speak throughout the country. The results of that study, in my mind, were fairly astounding. Of all of the mosques, 80% were very Sharia adherent, strict Sharia adherence. Now, I don't need to tell you what that means simply. Sharia includes all of the laws that we've talked about. It includes the law for death for anyone who would blaspheme Islam, the Prophet, the Ummah, the people of Islam. It also includes death for apostates. Anyone who would exercise religious freedom and decide to leave Islam would be subject to capital punishment. 80% of the mosques were strictly Sharia adherent. And almost every single one of those mosques had violent literature and called for jihad through the literature, through the preachings of the imam, and through outside speakers. The study was published in 2 peer-reviewed journals, the noteworthy Perspectives on Terrorism, which is a publication of the Terrorism Research Initiative, a global initiative by universities and governments to study terrorism, and appears online, and you can view that by going to our website and following the links. We've covered now the conclusion of the study. The Team B2 report that we mentioned earlier has another aspect. In addition to looking at the threat externally, the Team B2 book walks the reader through the evidence which the federal government has put together in any number of terrorism trials to examine what is the presence of the threat to America from Sharia and those who adhere to Sharia. Now, I hope I don't need to tell this audience that one of the largest proponents of Sharia and the embrace of Sharia through a global caliphate is the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, I might have had to describe that in a little bit more detail a few years ago, when very few people had heard of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood. But if you recall Egypt's recent travails, the Muslim Brotherhood came to power after Mubarak was dethroned in an election, and they were in power for approximately 2 years before they were overthrown by the military for being even too radical for that country. The Muslim Brotherhood, founded in 1930, has a singular goal: the establishment of a global caliphate achieved piecemeal by taking over one country after another and establish Sharia as the law of the land. You can read that in their manifesto. Hamas, the organization which is a designated terrorist organization in Gaza, is a subsidiary, a formal subsidiary of the Muslim Brotherhood, to give you an idea of this organization. In the United States, in 2000, late 2000, the federal government brought a criminal complaint against the largest Muslim charitable organization in the country, the Holy Land Foundation. In that criminal investigation, they uncovered a treasure trove of documents. They were all introduced into evidence. That trial exposed the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood had a goal, and this is all on wiretaps and actual documents. The Muslim Brotherhood had a goal in the early 1980s to establish itself in the United States, create civil rights organizations for Muslim Americans, but to use those organizations and others to penetrate into American society, into the fabric of the society, and to promote Sharia in every way it could. One of the pieces of evidence was a memorandum, a strategy. You can all read it, but I'll just mention the Muslim Brotherhood must understand their work in America is a kind of grand jihad in eliminating and destroying the Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers. Chicken Little it's not, Cassandra it may be. But what's clear is there is an organization that is global, that is well-funded, that is organized in the United States, and whose goal is to promote Sharia every which way it can, including using the courts. The lead organization of the Muslim Brotherhood of the United States is the Council on American Islamic Relations. The Council on American Islamic Relations, as a Muslim Brotherhood Hamas front group, operates in Washington, D.C., is invited to the White House, has chapters in every major city in the United States, and we end up doing battle with them in court more often than we'd like to admit. They're given legitimacy by media. Yet again, if you listen and examine the evidence in the Holy Land Foundation, you can literally listen to a tape of a surveilled conversation of a conference taking place in a hotel in Philadelphia in which these individuals, the current CEO of CARE, Nihat Awad, is on tape explaining their goals explicitly, exactly as we've described them this evening. Another area that we've engaged in this lawfare battle for American freedom against Sharia in the public policy arena is a draft model legislation called American Laws for American Courts. American Laws for American Courts was necessary for one reason. We found that in the state court systems, Sharia judgments from abroad and Sharia law was literally being used in state courts to deprive U.S. citizens of their rights. I won't go into all of the detail, but I'll give you one quick example. A Muslim man and woman came from Pakistan. They lived in Maryland. The Muslim man, tired of his wife, wanted to have a second wife, and he flew back to Pakistan. Under Sharia law, a man is allowed 4 wives. He went back to Pakistan. His wife insisted that if he were going to have a wife there and a wife in Maryland, she would want a divorce. He went to a Sharia court in Maryland and obtained a divorce literally with the expression of, I divorced my wife 3 times under Sharia law. He then got custody of his child because under Sharia law, it's not the best interest of the child. The father gets custody. He then got a court order from the Sharia court in Pakistan. There are Sharia courts there that have the power of the civil courts. He came to Maryland and he sought to enforce that judgment. The woman went to court to fight that in Maryland and explained to the court, had I gone to Pakistan to fight this case and presented my defense, I would have been put to death under Sharia for both apostasy and blasphemy. The Maryland courts, all the way to the appellate division, ruled as follows. This judgment rendered by a Sharia court, which denies you equal protection because you're a woman, denies you equal protection and due process because you're not a devout Muslim, is enforceable in this state with the power, the police power of this state. We will forcefully take your child and give it to your husband to go back to Pakistan to raise him. She asked, how could that be? I haven't had my day in court. Had I gone to court in Pakistan, I would have been put to death. And the court said, literally now, this is almost a quote, while it is true that this is the law of Sharia and it is applied in Pakistan, because we can't know that it would have happened in your case, the judgment stands. The woman lost custody. American Laws for American Courts says one thing very simply. No foreign judgment and no foreign law can be applied in any state court in a state that passes this legislation where the application of Sharia law or Sharia judgment or any foreign law would deprive the U.S. citizen of a fundamental constitutional liberty. A simple proposition. That law is passed in a half a dozen states. It's pending in another dozen. It's never been challenged in court. It's been on the books in some states for now 4 years. The criticism of American Laws for American Courts is the Chicken Little argument. It's not a problem here. Sharia is never going to take over the Constitution, yet we see in state courts it is literally inserted surreptitiously and it deprives U.S. citizens of their rights. one of the great badges of honor that I have and my colleague Robert Muse has is that we are labeled by the Muslim Brotherhood groups. CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, put out this study of the greatest Islamophobes in the country. Well, we rank right up there at the top. The Washington Post covered the publication. Many of the other media did as well. But let me just conclude before turning over the next portion of our presentation, which will be discussing the actual battle that takes place inside the courtroom, with the following. Nothing I've said here tonight, and nothing that I consider to be true, is critical of any Muslim, or even critical of an Islam that exists in some people's minds that is noble and peaceful. If it exists, I'm all for it. It's protected by the First Amendment. What I've described here tonight is an Islam undergirded and supported and maintained by the institutions of Sharia, and whose adherents have made it very clear they will not rest, they will not stop, they will not prevent their own engagement with jihad and murder simply because we put down our defenses and our arms and claim peace. Our job, the job of American Freedom Law Center and everyone who cares about freedom and liberty in this country, is to be aware of the threat and to do what you can to support the defense of freedom in this country. Thank you.
It's always a hard act to follow. I'm the Christian half of the Judeo-Christian that he referred to in the American Freedom Law Center. And I'm the Catholic guy from Michigan with 12 kids, and as I like to say, all of them are boys except for 10. So my colleagues heard me say this time and again, and the Catholic crowd will appreciate it. Blessed are you among women. That's the motto in the motto in my home. Well, I'm going to talk about Sharia and the threat to our Constitution. And what I'm going to go through tonight is literally just a small sampling of cases that David and I are litigating or have litigated. I literally could go on for the whole evening to go through cases, but this is just a sampling where you can see how our fundamental freedoms are being threatened and at grave risk. You know, that quote from the Muslim Brotherhood that came up in the Holy Land terrorism financing trial used the term civilization jihad. And I put up here, you know, our Constitution and stealth jihad. Stealth jihad is a term that was coined by Robert Spencer, who's, some of you may know, he's the author of Jihad Watch, as well as numerous books on Islam. And he coined that phrase, and it fits in with the civilization jihad. And again, bear in mind, the term civilization jihad is not my term, it's not my colleague's term, it's nobody up here's term, it's the Muslim Brotherhood's term. And I want to just, again, run through some cases, because I think these cases that we're litigating tell a story of their own, and it's a story that I think people need to be aware of. We have multiple cases, I'm going to kind of lump them together, where we've, and most of these are dealing with First Amendment rights to freedom of speech and right to religious liberty, because that's where the battle comes in here. We represent Pam Geller and Robert Spencer. I mentioned Robert already. They run various bus ads on transit agencies throughout the United States. Transit agencies are government agencies, so they're bound by the Constitution and the First Amendment. The CARE and these other organizations, they make great use, as they indicated, they're going to use, sabotage us by our own hands. They make great use of these different forms for speech to convey their message. To convey a message, in one particular, there was an advertisement that was anti-Israel, it was pro-Palestinian, and New York MTA, they ran that advertisement with no difficulty, no trouble. So our client said, oh, are you going to run that advertisement? We want to run this advertisement on your buses. In any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, support Israel, defeat jihad. And that top quote, any of you who are fans of Ayn Rand, it's a quote that she had famously made a while back. Well, the New York MTA said, no, we're not going to run this advertisement, even though you can criticize Israel and describe them essentially as violators of international law and persecutors of the poor Palestinians. You can't run this because this is disparaging to Muslims. So we sued, and we won. And the judge ruled in our favor, and this advertisement went up. So we then turned to Washington, D.C., because that's another location where this anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian ad was displayed, and we wanted to run the same ad in Washington. Well, the Washington authorities said, well, we're not going to run it because we fear violence. We fear that the Muslims are going to be outraged by this, and they're going to engage in violent acts, and it's going to be a danger to our transit authority. Well, we filed our lawsuit on a Tuesday. The judge had a hearing on Thursday. On Friday, she issued her order in our favor, and then on Monday morning, the advertisements went up in Washington, D.C. We've had this same advertisement now. We're engaging in the same battle in Boston, Massachusetts. In the Boston MBTA, they ran the similar Palestinian ad, but they refused our ad, the one that I had showed you previously, claiming that it was demeaning and disparaging to Muslims. We sued. The judge ruled in their favor. There's a really bad case in that circuit that we're trying to get overturned actually through the course of this case. So that case is on appeal to the next level, the U.S. Court of Appeals. Well, what the judge said in his ruling, he said, well, jihad doesn't necessarily mean violent jihad, doesn't necessarily mean, engaging in terrorist acts. And the court even acknowledged, even though he himself has used that term when he's dealing with criminal cases in his jurisdiction. And oh, by the way, we're in Boston, Massachusetts. You remember what happened at the Boston Marathon not too long ago? So what do the people understand jihad to mean in Boston? And even in the context of warfare. But he said, it wasn't unreasonable, even though it's not the most reasonable conclusion, it wasn't unreasonable for the MBTA to conclude that jihad meant just prayerful introspection. And so calling people who engage in prayerful introspection as savages, well, that's demeaning. So, you free speech advocates, you lose, the government wins on this one. So we appealed it. So we said, okay, if the concern was that that we were criticizing introspection as opposed to individuals who engage in violent jihad against Israel, as the advertisement plainly it makes clear on its face, we modified the ad. And in the modified ad, we said, okay, in any war between the civilized man and those who engage in savage acts, support the civilized man, support Israel, defeat violent jihad. Well, the MBTA now was stuck based on how the court ruled. So they had no choice but to accept the advertisement. So we said, okay, you accept that one. How about this one? In any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, support Israel, defeat violent jihad. So we made it very clear that we're talking only about violent jihad. Well, the MBTA was really now in a quandary, and they said, well, we can't accept this one. So we sued them on that one, and our judge agreed with them. So we're on appeal now on that one. So at the end of the day now, we have the First Amendment being decided upon whether or not you use a word here, savage, as an adjective or a noun. I mean, it's just how the First Amendment is so obscured when we're dealing the issue with Islam. And we'll see this time and again in some of these other cases that I'm bringing up. And this, I throw this up because this was an interesting headline from the Boston Globe. Because oftentimes when we bring in these litigation, they refer to us as Islamophobes or anti-Islam. But here, you can see this by engaging this dialogue, they actually had it correct here. Anti-Islamist. That's the point that David was making. We're talking about Islamists, not just Islam. It's not Islamophobia, it's Islamist. So I throw this up because it was very interesting, you can see how, I think even through our litigation, we've been able to shape even some of this public discourse on this very issue. Here's ads that CARE ran in Chicago, their jihad ad. My jihad is to stay fit despite my busy schedule. They had a whole series of these ads. So our client says, okay, if you're going to run those ads, this propaganda piece by CARE, we're going to propose these ads. Reloading, firing again, reloading, fire again, while screaming Allah Akbar. Victim of Major Nadal Hassan, Fort Hood jihad mass murder. That's his jihad. What's yours? Killing Jews is worship that draws us closer to Allah. Hamas TV. That's his jihad. What's yours? Well, the Chicago Transit Authority originally said, hey, we can't run these advertisements. You can run the CARE ads, but you can't run this advertisement. So we sent them a very polite letter saying, if you don't run them, we're going to sue you. And they sent a very polite letter back saying, well, we've seen that you guys were victorious in New York. You were victorious in Washington. Okay, we don't want to be sued. The ads will go up. So they ran the advertisements. Before our presentation, we were meeting before this, and David used the term lawfare, and that's the term I'll use. This is lawfare. We have to shape this battlefield. We have to shape the discourse. And sometimes, having success in cases can carry over where you can actually win a case without actually having to go through all the litigation just because of the reputation you've built in this particular area. Here's an advertisement that our clients wanted to run in Detroit, Michigan. And you'll see, I'm going to be talking about Dearborn quite a bit. Dearborn, Michigan, for those who don't know, has the largest Muslim concentration of any city in the United States. And I'm going to show you a couple of cases we have in Dearborn, and you can decide for yourself whether or not the political influence of Islam in that community has any effect on our constitutional freedoms. But this was an ad that they were going to run on the Detroit, the Metro. It's actually the name of the Metro's organization is the Suburban Mobility Authority for Regional Transportation, the acronym SMART. So SMART refused this advertisement because they said it was too political, even though they've run a host of what most people would consider political ads. So during the course of litigation, when I was deposing their witness and asking them about their policy, so how do you define political? And they said, well, it's conveying any message on a politicized issue. Like, okay, well, that's a tautology. So define for me politicized. Well, if there's a faction of people that are in disagreement on a subject, then it's politicized. Oh, really? Here's an advertisement that they ran with no problem and said it comported with their policy. Looks like a politicized issue to me. And when I asked them the question about this, they said, no, it's not a politicized issue. There's no factions of people that disagree on whether a God exists. I'm not making any of this up. So this case is on litigation right now. We've got cross motions for summary judgment. We'll see how that comes out. Here's an advertisement. This one was run by the State Department in Seattle, Washington. Faces of Global Terrorism. The FBI and the State Department have this program called Rewards for Justice, where they provide certain awards if you can provide information that leads to the identification or capture of a known terrorist. And the FBI has a most wanted global terrorist list. And right now there are 32 individuals on the FBI's most wanted global terrorist. It just so happens that 30 out of the 32 are engaged in terrorist acts in the name of Islam or on behalf of Islamic organizations. The other two, by the way, one's an environmentalist and another belongs to the Black Liberation Party. There are no Tea Party members nor pro-lifers in their list of most wanted terrorists, despite popular belief. So they ran this advertisement, and a group of Muslims, CARE included, called foul. This is offensive. This is demeaning to Muslims. All the individuals listed, and these individuals all listed here are actual individuals on their most wanted global terrorist list, are Muslim or have Muslim-sounding names. You can't run this advertisement. So the State Department, in the vein of political correctness, pulled the advertisement on their own and said, okay, we won't run this advertisement anymore. Again, even though these are the FBI's most wanted global terrorists. So our client said, okay, you're not going to run that ad. Here's our ad. So bear in mind that prior ad by the State Department was accepted by the Transit Authority, King County Transit Authority in Seattle, Washington. So they submitted this ad, and what did King County say? They rejected this ad. And why? They said it was demeaning and disparaging, and it was false and misleading. Really? Identifying the FBI's most wanted global terrorists and the Rewards for Justice program conveys a false and misleading message and demeans Muslims. This case is on appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit right now. Here's a case that I did in 2010. And I just want to set the stage. I have some video that's going to follow here momentarily. I represented 4 Christian missionaries. The four were Nabil Qureshi, David Wood, Paul Rezkala and Nagin Mayel. Nabil Qureshi has his MD. He also has an advanced degree in religious studies from Duke University. He was born and raised a Muslim, and he converted to Christianity. And he will say, without any hesitation, that the most important decision he ever made in his life was to become a Christian. And that had a lot of implications for him personally and socially and so forth. And he wanted to share that message with others. In Dearborn, Michigan, every year, except for last year, too much litigation that they kept losing. Last year, they didn't have the Arab Festival, but for about 17 straight years, they had the Arab Festival, which was the largest Arab festival in the U.S. Hundreds of thousands of people would come, and a lot of Christian missionaries would come as well to evangelize. It was a great opportunity for them to evangelize there at the Arab Festival. So Nabil would go with David Wood, his colleague. David Wood is an associate professor. He just recently got his doctorate, associate professor at Fordham University. He teaches philosophy. He is also a convert to Christianity, not from Islam, but he was an atheist and became a Christian. Paul Rezkala, who is a college student at NYU, and Nagin Mayel is another college student. Hardly a group of rabble-rousers. Well, Nabil and David ran an organization called Acts 17 Apologetics, and their mission was to minister to Muslims and to spread the good news and the gospel to them. And they would use video cameras and make use of the media because they figure, look, if I evangelize one or two people on the street, I can reach one or two people on the street. If I videotape it, I can perhaps reach thousands. In fact, some of their videos had more than 1 million people view them. And I'm going to show you a short clip of their evangelizing at the 2010 Arab Festival in Dearborn, Michigan. What you saw there was Nabil Qureshi, he was the individual in the red shirt, being placed in handcuffs, taken, and the other three as well, placed in handcuffs, taken to jail, where they spent the night in jail, and they were tried for breach of the peace. I defended them in a week-long criminal trial in the city of Dearborn, and thankfully they were acquitted. Here's what the police report, what you just saw in the video, here's the official police report from the City of Dearborn Police Department describing exactly what you just saw. As a result of Qureshi screaming into the crowd while uniformed officers were present, and the fact that the crowd had increased in numbers and agitation, all four were handcuffed and escorted to the police command post in an attempt to gain control of the situation and avoid a possible riotous crowd. Nagin Mayel, Nabil Qureshi, David Wood, and Paul Rizkala's actions caused the crowd to gather and become agitated. The weather conditions, hot and humid temperatures, fueled an already agitated crowd. This was evident by the crowds yelling profanities and repeated calls to security and police on the behavior of Mayel, Qureshi, Wood, and Rizkala. When uniformed officers were present, Qureshi was yelling into the crowd, further inciting the crowd. Nagin Mayel had already failed to obey a police officer. As a result of these behaviors, all four subjects were handcuffed and detained. During that criminal trial, in closing argument, I showed pretty much that same video to the jury, and I asked them simply, what you saw there, did that happen on a public street in the United States of America? Again, thankfully, they were acquitted of this criminal charge. My colleague and I, we filed a 100-page civil rights lawsuit against the city of Dearborn, its mayor, its chief of police, and 17 police officers. At the end of that litigation, the city of Dearborn issued an apology and paid $300,000 in damages. Nabil Qureshi just recently wrote a book. I'm doing a little plug for him because I got to tell you, it's a terrific book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And those who are interested about the trials that a Muslim goes through to convert to Christianity, you should read this book. Not only the social pressure and the family pressure associated with it, but giving a plug for Nabil because it's a very terrific book, and I think it fits in with what we've been describing here. 2 years later, and that was the second lawsuit that I had against the city of Dearborn. Actually, even before that 2010 incident, in 2009, I represented a Christian pastor, George Saig, who for years had been going to Dearborn and evangelizing and handing out literature on the public sidewalks. Again, this is a open public city street where, First Amendment rights are at their pinnacle in terms of protection. And he was handing out literature. Well, in 2009, they decided to pass this draconian restriction on literature distribution, and they told everybody that was going to distribute literature there, and it affected mostly the Christians that were there to evangelize, that they literally created this 5-block buffer zone where they had to be away from the festival area before they can hand out the literature. We sued the city of Dearborn and went all the way up to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, which is here in Cincinnati, and they ruled in our favor unanimously and struck down that speech restriction. 2010, we had the issue with the individuals that we just showed there with Nabil Qureshi. 2012, another group of Christians goes to the Arab Festival. This group, they call themselves the Bible Believers. They had signs with Christian messages on the signs. They were walking on the public streets during the course of this festival, which they had every right to do under the First Amendment, and this is what happened.
And keep safety, get us a bullpen.
And where were you when the bottles were flying?
I was grabbing people.
Well, no, there was officers that actually turned the other way.
Wait until it's...
Well, if you have a couple of uniforms, like
I don't
we
have a
talked
couple
about.
of uniforms. There's 100,000 people who come to this festival, and I got about 25 to 30 officers.
But just 2 officers, if you think it's a threat, so you're going to jeopardize free speech. You want to stop.
I'm not trying to jeopardize free speech.
Again, I just want to make it happen.
Yes.
So if we don't leave, you're saying we will.
If you don't leave, we're going to cite you for disorder.
Did you hear what he just said there at the end? They were walking on the street with signs. They were literally stoned in that city street with bottles, debris. Reuben Israel, the leader of the group, had blood pouring down the top of his head. They just asked for 2 police officers to be with them. And it was the county sheriff's department, and they had the largest, they even bragged about the fact that it was the largest detail they've ever had, larger than when the president visits Michigan, larger than they used for the Super Bowl. But yet when these, bottle throwers and rock throwers at these Christians, they couldn't spare 2 police officers to protect them from the violent acts. And so what was the county sheriff's response? If you, peaceful Christians, don't leave this Arab festival, we're going to arrest you for disorderly conduct, even though their conduct is fully protected under the First Amendment. And oh, by the way, the ones engaging in criminal acts were the ones disturbing the peace. That's known in First Amendment jurisprudence as a heckler's veto. And the police, and the law is pretty clear, police cannot join a mob intent on suppressing speech. They have a duty under the First Amendment to protect the speaker. That just got turned on its head. We filed a civil rights lawsuit against the Wayne County, and here's what a federal judge in Michigan ruled. This is a direct quote from out of his ruling. The court finds that the actual demonstration of violence here provided the requisite justification for defendants, that's the police, intervention, even if the officials acted as they did because of the effect the speech had on the crowd. Literally turned the First Amendment on its head. We appealed that case to the U.S. Court of Appeals here in the Sixth Circuit. I had oral argument on January 18th of this year, and the argument went very well, and I'm hopeful we're going to get a reversal from the Sixth Circuit. But how can this happen? I mean, you see that looked like something out of, from the West Bank, not on a city street. Is it just coincidence that it happens to be the city with the largest Muslim population? Here's a last case that I just want to run through, and this one kind of hit home with me. Jesse Nieto versus Flatow. Flatow was the commander of Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune, a place that I was stationed twice in the Marine Corps. My client in this case was Jesse Nieto. He's a retired gunnery sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, served for 25 years, did 2 combat tours in Vietnam. His son, his youngest son, was a sailor, and he was stationed aboard the USS Cole. His son happened to be one of the victims that died in that tragic terrorist attack on the USS Cole that killed, I believe, was 14 service members. His son was one of the 14 that was killed. So Gunny Nieto, on his vehicle, he also was an employee on base. He was retired, so he had full privileges to be on base. You have a base decal as a retiree. Plus, he was a civil employee that worked on base. So he had the right to be on base. And this is his vehicle. You can see his official license plate was USS Cole. I mean, this is a mourning father who lost his son to violent terrorism. And so he put these decals on his vehicle. We died, they rejoiced. No quarter for Islamic terrorists. Here's a picture of Gunny Nieto. Well, he was pulled aside one day by the base magistrate because they had gotten a complaint, apparently, by a Muslim who was on base about his decals. And they gave Gunny Nieto an option. They said, you can either scrape off your base decal or scrape off these other decals. And he said, I'm not going to change my decals on my vehicle. I mean, this literally was a father mourning for the loss of his son. So they issued him an order and banned him from coming on any federal installation. So he couldn't come on Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune. He couldn't go down to Norfolk, where they had the monument for the USS Cole. He couldn't go to Arlington National Cemetery, where there's a monument for the loss of his son. So we sued in federal court in North Carolina, and we won. The judge ruled in our favor and said this was viewpoint discrimination, and he ordered them to enjoin their speech restriction. And I got to tell you, I can remember vividly to this day when I picked up that phone and I called Gunny Nieto and told him that we won. I could tell, and this guy, he was tough as nails. You can tell he's actually a Native American Indian, and every time I went down to take depositions, he was always showing me whatever gun he had in his vehicle for him. But this was a tough man, and when I told him that we won and he could go back on that base with his vehicles, he was audibly crying on the other end. It made a big deal for him. So I just want to wrap it. I just want to give you a sampling to sort of take from the theoretical and see in a practical how in this area when you're dealing with Islam, even speech that might be construed as critical of Islam is just treated differently. There is this civilization jihad that's going on, and we're losing our freedoms, but we got to keep fighting for them. You know, Ronald Reagan, I quote this time, and I'll end with this quote. You know, he reminded us that, you know, our freedoms weren't handed down to us through the bloodstream. You know, we can't take them for granted. They must be fought for and protected, lest they become one generation away from becoming extinct. And that's what we do at the American Freedom Law Center every day, is to fight for your freedoms in cases like this in public policy arenas. Thank everyone for taking the time out on a Tuesday night to come out and listen to us, and we appreciate it. Thank you.